His extraordinary tenure in the United States Senate was characterized by vision, leadership, and by bipartisanship to global issues ranging from nuclear non-proliferation to food security and foreign aid effectiveness. It is truly difficult to imagine what the world would look like if not for Senator Lugar and Senator Sam Nunn's extraordinary effort to secure one of the most remarkable bipartisan achievements, the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. Since its inception, the program has deactivated over 7,600 warheads, destroyed 902 intercontinental ballistic missiles, and secured 24 nuclear weapons storage sites. As chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Lugar was instrumental in obtaining Senate approval for the START Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, the Chemical Weapons Treaty, and the U.S.-India Civilian Nuclear Agreement. It should come as no surprise that Senator Lugar holds 47 honorary degrees from universities across the United States. He is the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth conferred upon him the honorary rank of Knight Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. This statesman's contribution to the world will be felt for years to come. And I do want to add that when he spoke last to the Foreign Policy Association just 2 months ago and delivered the Andrew Carnegie Distinguished Lecture on Conflict Prevention in honor of David Hamburg, he received a standing ovation, and that's only the third one in my 23 years at the Foreign Policy Association. So without further ado, Senator Richard Lugar.
Mr. Chairman, thank you once again for your hospitality and your very generous introduction and your leadership for the Foreign Policy Association. It's truly an honor to be here with all of you at the Foreign Policy Association for this opportunity. An honor to speak to you today. I'm delighted to be especially here among so many friends who are devoted to improving the security of our country, expanding opportunities for international cooperation. Like many of you, I've spent most of my adult life praying and working for a world without nuclear dangers, even as I know that it is unlikely that that will happen in my lifetime. We dream of a gentler future when humanity's goals to feed the hungry, cure the ill, protect our planet, and advance human understanding can be realized without the threat of nuclear annihilation. We may pray and dream, but we also know that we have an obligation to study the uncomfortable reality that confronts us. And that study, even in our most hopeful days, leads us to sober conclusions about probabilities and change. We look at the Indian subcontinent with two heavily armed nuclear powers in a cauldron of territorial disputes, terrorism, and historic animosities. We cast an eye on North Korea with its growing arsenal of nuclear weapons and its deeply unpredictable regime. We think of the Middle East with so many cross-cutting problems, sources of instability, and proliferation scenarios. We ponder how many terrorist cells associated with Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State are configuring plots to obtain nuclear material or a working nuclear device. We lament the reversion of relations with Russia that has brought greater instability to the world and the reimposition of a Cold War mentality. Now, we're hopeful idealists because in the nuclear security field, idealism sometimes leads to amazing results. But we also are realists because our duty imposes on us the burdens of clarity and truthfulness. As leaders in the nuclear security field, we embrace this dichotomy and the personal and professional challenges it brings. We study the problem deeply and go to work on potential solutions that we know must be turned into reality. Many of you undertake this work each day, surrounded by fellow travelers who are specialists in the nuclear security field. I suspect that this provides certain reassurance, as this conference certainly does, that nuclear security is receiving constant attention. But my own experience in the United States Senate was different than that. Nuclear security was one of hundreds of issues the Senate dealt with in any given year. Most of the colleagues understood the gravity of the nuclear dilemma, but the crush of other important business, from the budget and health care to helping constituents and navigating 350 or more votes each year, meant that only a few of us could spend a lot of time on the problem. It also meant that those who did, like Sam Nunn and myself, often functioned as educators as well as legislators, attempting to convince colleagues of what was at stake and generate the votes necessary to advance good nuclear security policies. We were constantly reminding our colleagues that what makes nuclear security such a difficult task is the inexorable nature of the threat and the need to be perfect. Most other areas of policy allow for imperfection, some time to learn, or at least some time to execute a transition. With nuclear security, our message was that any gap in our understanding, our preparation, or our cooperation with other countries is clearly dangerous, and everything is at risk if we fail in this one area. Containing the nuclear threat is not just a security problem, it's an economic dilemma and the moral challenge of the current age. Beyond the initial horrific loss of life that can be caused by a nuclear explosion, efforts to advance standards of living throughout the world would be undercut drastically by the uncertainty and the fear that would follow even an isolated nuclear attack. As a reality check, in 2005, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, of which I was chairman at that time, conducted an informal survey of 83 nuclear security experts and control professionals. Many of those who participated in the survey had been, or would go on to be, high government officials. They included Ash Carter, Bill Cohen, Frank Carlucci, Bill Burns, and Strobe Talbot, among many others. We also included academic and think tank professionals, and even some journalists who covered national security issues. And we included not just Americans, but also foreign experts. The Lugar Survey on Proliferation Threats and Responses was not meant to be a scientific survey. Rather, it was a sample of expert opinions about the spectrum of WMD threats that we face at that moment in history. Most questions focused on defining WMD risks over 5 and 10-year time horizons. Now, we're now a dozen years removed from when the survey was taken, so the responses provide some useful perspective. The good news is that humanity did better over the ensuing 10 years than the experts predicted. For example, when asked, quote, how many nations will join the nuclear weapons club during the next 10 years, end of quote, 90% of respondents predicted that we would see at least 2 new nuclear weapon states in that period. Moreover, the average and median responses among the group predicted that 4 new nuclear powers would be added. In fact, only North Korea was definitively added during those 10 years, and some respondents may have considered that nation to have been already a nuclear weapon state. We also asked the experts' views of the percentage probability that some type of nuclear attack would occur during the ensuing 10 years. The median probability cited by the group was 20%. The average probability cited was almost 30%. Thankfully, we've gone 2 years beyond the 10-year period with no nuclear attack. Now, it's tempting to draw conclusions from this outcome that are more dramatic than are warranted. Did we actually outperform the experts' expectations? Are we safer now than we were 12 years ago? Do we deserve some credit for our avoidance of nuclear disaster in that period? Or were we just lucky? Have nuclear risks risen substantially, even as we did not experience the calamity? As interesting as the survey was, it is difficult to say definitively that we are more or less safe than we were in 2005. Each moment of the nuclear age comes with its own dangers, both expected and unforeseen. Each moment comes with its own political, economic, and social context that makes containing nuclear dangers a unique challenge. It is this broader context that is especially troubling at the current moment in history. There were strong indicators that the world is entering a period of potential hyper-instability, driven by forces that were not a factor just a decade ago. A recent column by Robert Samuelson pointed to a theory of investor and author Richard Sharma, who contends that we have entered an extended period when economic growth in most parts of the globe will routinely fail to reach expectations that prevailed before 2008. Sharma writes, and I quote, "Between the end of World War II and the financial crisis of 2008, the global economy was supercharged by explosive population growth, a debt boom that fueled investment and boosted productivity, and an astonishing increase in cross-border flows of goods, money, and people. Today, all three trends have begun to sharply decelerate." End of quote from Sharma. He stated further, this has led to a, quote, growing disconnect between the political mood and the economic reality, end of quote. Now, we've seen some recent examples of political outcomes that seem at least partly motivated by this disconnect. These include, in my judgment, the Brexit vote, the election of President Donald Trump, and the growing prominence of nationalist and populist parties in Europe. Even if Sharma is too pessimistic on the declining potential for global economic growth, his argument underscores that economic trouble can drive conflict, can increase instability, and cause the rise of populist governments devoted to satisfying the political demands of disgruntled voting blocs. These destabilizing economic forces are compounded by other features of our contemporary world, including climate change, cyber vulnerabilities, food insecurity, communicable disease threats, and refugee flows. As arms control advocates, we need to understand these broader forces and attempt to integrate them into our thinking and our plans. What worries me most about the global political climate is the decline in effective governance and human rights, and the acceleration of populist and nationalist trends will undercut our ability to prevent nuclear proliferation and respond to nuclear crises. Containing nuclear threats requires both a willingness to seek international solutions and a willingness to set aside short-term political expediency in the interest of long-term goals. Nationalism, by its nature, is frequently at odds with international solutions, and populism is usually focused on short-term economic demands. Neither political trend is conducive to far-sighted solutions to global problems. Moreover, leaders in various countries who take advantage of nationalist and populist anger often employ foreign crises, resentment of immigrants, and armed conflict to distract citizens from corruption and other domestic failures of governance. The bottom line is that nuclear security, despite its gravity, is not immune to domestic political failures in this country or abroad. We cannot assume that governments will prioritize the issue that we see as an existential threat, let alone make political sacrifices in pursuit of a safer world. We cannot even assume that governments and institutions that have served as bulwarks against proliferation and other nuclear risks will always continue to play that role. Although it is too soon to fully grade the Trump administration on its commitment to nuclear security, there are obvious points of current concern. These start with the administration's failure to fill senior cabinet department positions related to nuclear policy and its broad budget proposals that would cut diplomatic and development funding that greatly impacts nuclear security. We know relatively little about President Trump's thinking on nuclear issues. We do know that he has raised the profile and stakes related to North Korea's nuclear weapons and their means of delivery. He's also stated his desire to expand military spending. He's voiced his willingness to incorporate the threat of military action into international security scenarios. The President also has a well-known affinity for deal-making, and he may well build a team that emphasizes transactional agreements. But beyond these points, there has been very little evidence thus far that the President has a detailed nuclear security strategy, or that he's prioritizing preventative diplomacy, cooperative threat reduction, existing arms control regimes, or other non-military tools developed to prevent a catastrophic nuclear event. On North Korea, President Trump has offered vague assurances that the decades-old problem, quote, will be solved, period, end of quote. The administration also has hosted a briefing on North Korea at the White House with all 100 senators to demonstrate its seriousness on the issue. But the President and his team must go further in engaging partners in the region, congressional leaders, the United Nations, and other international actors on the development of a credible multilateral strategy for addressing the threat from North Korea. Perhaps most significantly, the President's strident America First campaign message, on display again in Brussels this week, continues to call into question his alliance commitments to NATO and his support for other key international institutions. The United States' commitment to Article 5 of the NATO Charter is not just a bargaining chip. It is one of the bedrock principles of our own defense and our determination to preserve peace in Europe. It's exceedingly dangerous to display any doubts to our friends and adversaries about America's commitment to the defense of NATO countries. Secretary Rex Tillerson, Secretary James Madison, and Vice President Pence have voiced U.S. support for Article 5, but they are not the President of the United States. Their assurances cannot overcome the doubts created by President Trump standing before the leaders of NATO in front of NATO's headquarters during a solemn occasion and conspicuously declining to reinforce the Article 5 commitment. We have witnessed recent examples of Russian aggression near the frontiers of the NATO alliance. The President must understand that Article 5 is the main guarantor that allies will not be attacked and the main deterrent of provocative actions by Russia that could escalate into nuclear confrontation. More broadly, it's imperative to recognize that our success in controlling weapons of mass destruction depends on cooperation with other nations and on leading, maintaining, and expanding a global consensus on non-proliferation principles. To the degree that the United States fails to develop a comprehensive strategy and fails to exercise leadership or calls its own commitments into doubt, we create opportunities for others to undercut this consensus. The administration's equivocation on an array of previous global commitments, including the Iran nuclear deal, the Paris Climate Accords, and the bedrock trade agreements like NAFTA, risk fractures in an alliance system that is essential to our national security. I've seen firsthand what can be achieved through international cooperation. For more than 2 decades as the United States Senator, I joined with hundreds of dedicated leaders in the United States, NATO allies, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, many other countries who contributed to the success of the Non-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. The program safeguarded and destroyed a large portion of the vulnerable nuclear arsenal and infrastructure of the USSR so that it would not be susceptible to theft or diversion. Political collapse and economic hardship had left warheads, delivery systems, and technology vulnerable to diversion or sale. A vast cadre of scientists, engineers, and military personnel who had spent much of their professional careers supporting the Soviet WMD complex faced the prospect of not being paid. In essence, the political structure and financing that had kept the enormous Soviet WMD industry a tightly controlled and relatively secure system had completely broken down. The prospect of rapid proliferation of knowledge, materials, and even weapons themselves was never higher than at that moment. Executing the Non-Lugar program was an improbable undertaking requiring just not political and diplomatic breakthroughs, but also engineering and managerial excellence. The lesson to be learned from that experience is that extraordinary nuclear security results based on mutual interest are possible. Nuclear disasters are not inevitable if we have the will and energy to keep working for a safer world and explore innovative solutions. For the foreseeable future, the United States and the world will continue to face an existential threat from nuclear weapons. We are a long way from realizing our nuclear security goals, but I believe we can develop and strengthen the international agreements and norms that can prevent terrorists from gaining access to nuclear weapons and dissuade nuclear weapon states from using the ones they possess. I appreciate the talents that each one of you bring to these goals and our mutual determination to maintain a peaceful world. We should have confidence that this devotion can lead to productive solutions on behalf of nuclear security. I hope that I will have many opportunities to work with you for many, many years to come to allay these difficulties and to find victory. More power to all of you. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Senator has graciously, thank you so much for those very inspiring remarks. Senator Lugar has graciously agreed to take a few questions. Do you have any questions in this group? You must have given us such an exhaustive, Jonathan.
Yes, sir.
Well, first, as an American, I want to thank you. You built bridges where there were walls before. You created a win-win situation in getting rid of nuclear weapons. And you exemplified putting the public good above partisanship. Presently, I'm the president of the Global Security Institute, and we formed the Bipartisan Security Group. We had a robust group with Congressman Shays and Congressman Markey in the House when they were there. But now we're trying to find Republican senators to speak with, and we've been unable to do that. Could you talk about how we might overcome the toxic partisan divide, particularly on international security issues, and give us some advice particularly those of us who are trying to build bridges, how we might do so.
Well, without naming names, I can think of some Republican senators who may very well be amenable to being a part of that situation. There are, as you know, several bipartisan groups in Washington that meet. And I've heard from, I think, most of them at our Lugar Center. This is a small think tank we started 4 years ago. One of our objectives is bipartisanship. We've created an index with the McCourt School at Georgetown University, which we rate all 100 senators and all 435 members of the House on their bipartisanship. And the criteria we use is how many bills have you offered that got somebody on the other aisle, side of the aisle, to co-sponsor? Or how many times have you reached over to deliberately co-sponsor something? And leading the pack right now is Susan Collins, the senator from Maine, who is a Republican. Joe Donnelly, from my home state of Indiana, a Democrat, is the leading Democrat, at least on the Senate side. I would add that Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz are number 99 and 100 at the other end of the line. But it has brought the beginning of some conversation among papers in constituents' places in the states and in the districts as to why are you not here, there, yon, or what? And questions then come back to us privately. What can I do to upgrade my status? So there is interest in this. Now, it's a difficult time, in fairness, in terms of practical politics, because the polarization has been especially nasty, to say the least. But it's not impossible. My guess is that we're moving toward a time in which there are going to be identified many more senators who might begin to fit the criteria that you were framing there. And this is very, very important. Without going into all the history of the non-Lugar business, the fact is that Sam Nunn was a Democrat, and he was a leader, head of the Armed Services Committee. I was a Republican from time to time, chairman of Foreign Relations when Republicans were in the majority. And we came together because we appreciated that in the year in which it appeared the Soviet Union was collapsing, that we could tell from 5 years of travel in Russia and around from the time of the '86 Geneva Conference that failed, that things were falling apart. And I just mentioned a table about the size of the one right in front of me, a little bit more round. Some of the Russians whom we had met over the years came to Sam's office. The table was sitting there. And I remember one lady looked at me straight in the eye and said, "You folks in the United States have got a lot more trouble than you think you have." And I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" She said, "Well," she says, "the people that are guarding the nuclear weapons that are aimed at you are deserting. They're leaving their posts. They're not getting paid. Some are trying to take away fissile material or other situations they think they might sell to somebody." And so as a result, 40 years of mutually assured destruction, but it might not last because there could be an accident, not just a deliberate shot. So I said, "Well, what do you want from us?" And she said, "Well, you're going to need money, a lot of money, because we're bankrupt. We need engineers and people who know how to take down the missiles, take off the warheads, begin this process." And so this is really the beginning. Ash Carter came down from the Belfer School at Harvard. He wrote a so-called white paper, and this formed a lot of the basis of our legislation. We had only 3 months to pass it, and Congress was adjourning. As it turned out, it was passed 1 week before the Soviet Union failed. But nevertheless, it didn't create disarmament immediately. It did create funds that were available to the president, and the beginnings then of an apparatus to work for the mutual good of the safety of Russia and the United States and the rest of the world. Now, I would say that these situations may not exist in the same respect again. I cannot anticipate somebody from North Korea coming to a round table in the United States, We're really haven't got to that point of negotiations. We would not have been at that point without the Geneva Conference in 1986, in which President Reagan felt that finally the Russians would talk. They weren't ready to talk until that time. As it turned out, they were not quite that willing yet. But Reagan asked 16 senators, 8 Democrats, 8 Republicans, got back to the bipartisan thing, to go to Geneva. So in case we did get a deal, the possibilities of getting a 2/3 majority in the Senate were there. So those 16 senators continued to have an interest in this throughout this period of time, so that when we came to that 3 months in which we had to act, we got a very big majority on the Senate floor. I must say there were some conservative Republicans that said, "Not one dime for the Russians. They don't deserve a dime." We said, well, that's not the problem. But in any event, that was the beginning. But to get to your point again, for 20 years, even after Sam left the Senate, I had to keep getting a majority in the appropriation bill every year. We had the money for the Russians. And then to work for the disarmament treaties that were mentioned today, so that, in fact, we moved really in a very stable, diplomatic, professional way to take down our weapons that were about as substantial as the Russians may have had 10,000 plus, 10,000 minus, but we're now down to the 1,200, 1,400, whatever the New START treaty provides for. So the whole world is safer by 80%, to use the 80% that was used in the lecture this morning. So there's a long answer to your question, but hopefully at least fills in some of the blanks.
Well, Senator, thank you. You have exhausted our questions, and you've given us a wonderful set of remarks.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you.